"We're alone, let's do what's necessary," said the Apache woman given to a mountain man as a joke. Elia's heart had always preferred the company of the mountains to that of people. He had spent most of his life moving through the vast, untamed wilderness of the American Southwest. The mountains were harsh and unkind, but they were honest. A man could not hide from the snow, the cold, or the animals that roamed the forests and valleys. Elias had learned long ago to read the land, to understand its moods, and to respect its power. He was a mountain man, hardened by years of solitude, yet skilled in ways most people of the towns and villages could never understand. On this morning, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden glow over the peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint tang of distant streams. Elias crouched low, following the fresh tracks of a beaver along a narrow creek. He moved quietly, every step measured, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of the forest. The world felt alive around him, from the rustle of leaves to the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was a world where silence was as valuable as skill, and every sound carried a meaning. As he followed the tracks, Elias thought about the trade ahead. Beaver pelts were in high demand in the east, and the journey would be long. But the promise of gold coins and the respect of his peers made the cold mornings and harsh nights worthwhile. His mind wandered briefly to the people he had left behind. Not family exactly, for he had none, but acquaintances from the small settlements along the way. Townsfolk often looked at him with a mix of fear and admiration. To them, Elias was a legend, a man who could survive where others would perish. Yet he felt little connection to their lives. Their concerns were trivial compared to the needs of a man living in the wild. It was then that he noticed something unusual. The tracks in the snow were not just those of a beaver or a deer, they were human. At first, Elias thought it might be another trapper, but the footprints were smaller, lighter, and moved with a grace that spoke of someone used to the land. He paused, scanning the surrounding forest. The wind carried a faint hint of smoke, perhaps from a fire or a cooking place. Elias' instincts told him to be cautious. Humans could be unpredictable, especially those who roamed these lands freely. Carefully, he followed the footprints, staying low among the rocks and trees. The trail led him to a small clearing where a fire had been made, now smoldering with soft gray smoke. And there, sitting near the fire, was a group of Apache people. Elias froze, hiding behind a large boulder, his heart beating steadily but cautiously. He had met Native Americans before, sometimes traded with them, sometimes fought against those who did not welcome him. But this group seemed calm, and the way they moved carried a confidence that told Elias they were skilled and aware of every possibility in the forest. Among them was a young woman. She caught his eye immediately. There was something in her stance, a mix of confidence and humor that made her stand out. She was small in size but moved with a lightness that suggested strength. Her eyes were sharp, observing everything with intelligence. She wore practical clothing suited to the wilderness, and her hair was tied back to keep it from falling into her face. What struck Elias most was the way she smiled, not a shy or timid smile, but one that seemed to challenge and tease at the same time. Elias watched silently, unsure whether he should reveal himself. He had no intention of starting trouble, yet he knew he could not simply pass by unnoticed. The woman's eyes met his just for a moment, and she tilted her head slightly. It was a gesture that Elias could not fully read. Was it curiosity, amusement, or a test? He remained hidden, considering his next move. The group began to pack up their fire, gathering their belongings with practiced efficiency. It was then that Elias realized they were moving deeper into the forest, and they seemed to expect him to follow. He hesitated, but curiosity and caution drove him forward. He stepped lightly, making sure not to snap any twigs underfoot. As he drew closer, the woman noticed him again. This time she spoke in a language Elias could not understand, but her tone was playful, almost teasing. Her companions laughed softly, and Elias sensed he had stumbled into something unusual. Finally, the woman approached him directly. She stopped a few feet away, her hands resting lightly on her hips. Elias raised his hands in a gesture of peace, showing he meant no harm. She looked him over carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly, then widening as if she found something amusing. Without speaking a word he could understand, she made a gesture, one hand pointing at him, then at herself, then at the group. Elias understood enough. She was saying that he was part of this moment now, whether he liked it or not. Then she spoke again in broken English, her voice carrying a teasing note. "We're alone, let's do what's necessary." Elias froze. The words sounded like a joke, a challenge, but also a statement of survival. He realized that this was not a threat but a test. The group had given her to him in jest, a way to see how he would react. The humor was strange but not unfriendly. Elias felt a mixture of surprise and relief. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the situation without committing to anything beyond what was required for safety. Over the next few hours, Elias observed the group. They moved with a rhythm born of experience, packing efficiently, setting traps, and preparing food. The woman stayed close to him, continuing her playful gestures and teasing comments. Elias learned quickly that she was not just teasing for amusement. It was a way to communicate, to build trust in a language beyond words. He found himself admiring her skill, her confidence, and her ability to navigate the wilderness with ease. As night fell, Elias and the group settled near a stream. He watched the woman as she helped tend the fire, her movements precise and careful. The forest around them grew quiet, the only sounds coming from the water and the occasional rustle of animals in the dark. Elias realized that he felt a strange sense of comfort in this presence. Despite the initial tension and uncertainty, he knew he was in capable hands. They shared a simple meal, mostly dried meat and roasted roots. Elias offered some of his supplies, and she accepted with a nod of appreciation. Communication was minimal, but the gestures and expressions carried meaning. Elias began to understand that survival in these mountains was not just about skill, but also about connection, even fleeting connection with those around him. Later, as they prepared to sleep under the stars, the woman spoke again, her voice soft but firm. She pointed toward the sky, then to herself, then to Elias. He realized she was offering guidance, a way to stay safe during the cold night. He followed her directions, arranging the fire and bedding carefully. The night was cold, but the warmth of the fire and the knowledge that he was not entirely alone made it bearable. Elias lay on the ground, staring up at the stars, thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought him here. A woman given to him as a joke had become an unexpected companion, a teacher, and a guide. He felt a respect for her that went beyond words. She had challenged him, teased him, and yet protected him in ways he had not anticipated. Through the long night, Elias reflected on the wilderness, on the people who called it home, and on the delicate balance between trust and caution. He realized that the mountains had a way of teaching lessons that towns and settlements could not. Survival depended not just on skill, but also on understanding, observation, and the willingness to adapt. By dawn, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. The sun rose over the peaks, casting light on the forest and illuminating the path ahead. He looked at the woman, who smiled knowingly, as if she understood his thoughts. The bond formed in this quiet, snowy canyon was unusual, born of circumstance and necessity. Yet it was real, grounded in respect, skill, and the shared experience of navigating a world that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Elias knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. There would be challenges, dangers, and decisions that required both courage and wisdom. But for the first time in a long while, he felt that he was not entirely alone. He had a companion, a guide, and a mirror of his own resilience in the face of nature's trials. And as they set out together, moving silently through the forest, Elias understood that this encounter would change the way he saw the wilderness, and perhaps himself forever. The first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley where Elias and Natsa had spent the night. The cold air was sharp, yet refreshing, carrying the scent of wet pine and the faint aroma of the creek nearby. Elias rose slowly, brushing the frost from his jacket, careful not to disturb the small fire still smoldering. He glanced at Natsa, who was already moving with quiet precision, gathering small bundles of firewood and checking their supplies. She moved like someone born in the wild, every step measured and sure. Elias admired her skill. He had spent years surviving in the wilderness alone, yet there was something about the way she handled herself that was different. She seemed to know the forest not just as a place to hunt or hide, but as a living entity, full of patterns and rhythms that only she could read. Her eyes scanned the trees constantly, and her hands worked quickly, never wasting emotion. He realized that in a world so harsh, experience and instinct were the most valuable tools a person could carry. They began their journey deeper into the forest, moving along narrow trails that twisted between tall pines and rocky outcrops. Elias noticed how she paused at times, listening to sounds he could barely hear, following trails that he might have missed. Every now and then she would glance back at him, raising an eyebrow or giving a small nod, silently checking that he was keeping pace. It was a subtle way of testing him, not in hostility, but in curiosity, to see whether he could survive alongside her in this unforgiving land. The day stretched on with long hours of walking, punctuated by moments of quiet observation. Elias tried to engage her in conversation, asking about her people, her life, and the ways she had learned to survive in the wilderness. She answered in broken English, sometimes using gestures or miming actions to make her meaning clear. He learned quickly that patience was essential. Understanding her required not only listening, but observing carefully. Every glance, every movement carried meaning. By midday, they reached a small clearing where the sun shone warmly on a cluster of rocks. Elias spotted fresh tracks of deer along the edge of the clearing. He motioned to Natsa, pointing silently, and she nodded, kneeling to study the tracks closely. They decided to follow the trail, moving slowly, keeping low and careful. Elias was reminded again that survival depended not just on strength, but on attention to detail, and on the ability to anticipate what the forest would offer or hide. As they moved, Elias and Natsa began to share small portions of their supplies. He offered some dried meat, and she responded by giving him a handful of berries she had gathered along the trail. Their shared resources became a small ritual, a way to build trust without words. It was strange for Elias, who had spent so many years alone, to feel this quiet connection. He realized that even in the wild, no man could survive entirely on his own. Companionship, even one born of circumstance, could be as vital as any tool or weapon. Around late afternoon, the forest changed. The trees grew taller and the underbrush thicker, making the trail more difficult to navigate. Elias noticed how Natsa seemed completely at home, moving through the dense brush as if it were open ground. She occasionally paused to remove branches that might trip him or pointed out areas where the ground was soft or dangerous. It was in these moments that he began to appreciate the depth of her knowledge. Every step she took was calculated, not just for her own safety, but for his as well. They came across a small stream winding through the forest. The water was clear, and Elias took a moment to drink, cupping his hands to catch the cold flow. Natsa knelt beside him, pointing to the rocks where small fish swam near the surface. With a few carefully chosen words and gestures, she taught him how to catch them using simple traps and hand techniques. Elias watched intently, realizing that survival was not just about strength or weapons, but about observation, patience, and understanding the life around him. As evening approached, the temperature dropped quickly. The mountains were unforgiving, and Elias could feel the cold seeping through his jacket and gloves. Natsa, however, seemed unaffected. She collected firewood efficiently, stacking it in a precise manner that would produce the most warmth. Elias worked alongside her, mimicking her techniques, though he knew he could never match her speed or skill. By the time the fire was burning steadily, the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the stars beginning to appear one by one. They settled near the fire, and Elias noticed a small smile on her face. It was not playful this time, but a soft, almost tender expression, as if she recognized the effort he had made to follow her lead. They ate a simple meal, mostly fish and roots, speaking very little. Words were not necessary for understanding. The fire's warmth, the shared effort, and the mutual respect were enough to carry them through the long evening. Later that night, the wind began to pick up. The forest grew colder, and the shadows cast by the fire danced across the trees. Elias felt a sense of unease. The wilderness could be beautiful, but it could also be dangerous. Natsa noticed his tension and gave a small, reassuring nod. She pointed to a sheltered spot behind a cluster of boulders and gestured for him to follow. Together, they set up a temporary sleeping area, using branches and ferns to create insulation. Elias realized that these small lessons were more than about survival. They were about learning to trust another person, to move as a team, and to respect the rhythm of the land. As they lay down to rest, Elias thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. A woman given to him as a joke had become a companion and a guide. He remembered her words from the first day, "We're alone, let's do what's necessary," and he understood them now in a broader sense. It was not just about survival, but about connection, trust, and adapting to a world that demanded both courage and wisdom. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the distant howl of wolves and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Elias kept one eye open, watching the fire and the shadows beyond. He felt a quiet gratitude for Natsa's presence. She had taught him to read the signs of the forest, to anticipate danger, and to move with purpose. In return, he offered his strength, his knowledge of traps, and his unwavering determination to survive. Together, they had formed a bond that was unusual, yet deeply effective. Morning arrived with a soft mist hanging over the trees. Elias stretched, feeling the ache of muscles unused to carrying supplies over long distances. Natsa was already awake, collecting water from the stream and checking the paths they would follow. Elias joined her, and together they planned the day ahead. They needed to find food, maintain warmth, and continue navigating the challenging terrain. Every decision mattered, and every choice could affect their safety. As they walked through the forest, Elias noticed how the small routines they had established created a rhythm to their journey. He learned to anticipate her movements, to understand her signals, and to act without hesitation. She, in turn, adapted to his methods, incorporating his knowledge of traps and techniques into their daily routine. The forest was no longer just a backdrop for survival. It had become a place of learning, cooperation, and quiet understanding. By midday, they spotted a small herd of deer grazing near a ridge. Elias raised a hand, signaling to stop. Natsa nodded, crouching low and preparing her bow. Together, they moved silently, using the natural cover of the trees and rocks. The hunt was careful and deliberate, each movement measured to avoid startling the animals. When the opportunity arose, Natsa released her arrow with precision, and one deer fell. Elias quickly moved to secure it, understanding the importance of efficiency and teamwork. After the successful hunt, they worked together to prepare the meat, using fire and simple tools to preserve it for the journey ahead. Elias marveled at her skill. She seemed to know instinctively how much heat to use, how to arrange the meat to dry without spoiling. These were lessons he could not have learned alone, and he felt a deep respect for her knowledge and experience. Evening came again, and with it, another night in the mountains. Elias and Natsa built a fire, shared their meal, and settled into the rhythm of survival. The bond between them had grown stronger, based not on words, but on shared effort, trust, and respect. Elias realized that this experience, born from a strange joke and unusual circumstances, was teaching him more than just survival skills. It was teaching him about connection, resilience, and the quiet strength found in cooperation. As they lay under the stars, Elias thought about the journey ahead. The mountains would remain challenging, and dangers would always exist. Yet with Natsa by his side, he felt a sense of confidence he had never known. They were learning from each other, adapting to each other's strengths, and forming a partnership built on necessity, respect, and understanding. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but the air carried a chill that reminded Elias and Natsa that the mountains could not be trusted. Frost clung to the branches, and the forest floor was slick with dew. Elias adjusted his pack and scanned the horizon, alert for any signs of danger. Natsa, as usual, moved ahead with quiet confidence, her sharp eyes picking out tracks and paths that Elias would have missed. He had learned to trust her instincts completely, but he could not help the gnawing tension in his chest that came from knowing the wilderness was full of hidden threats. They followed a narrow ridge that wound through the mountains, the path steep and rocky. Every step required careful attention, as one misstep could lead to injury. Elias watched Natsa carefully, noting how she balanced herself, how she moved with a grace that only years of experience could produce. He mirrored her movements, learning the subtle shifts in weight and timing that made her so effective at traversing dangerous terrain. It was not just survival, it was an art form, a dance between human and nature. As they descended into a small valley, Elias noticed fresh tracks in the mud. Wolves, perhaps, or another predator. Natsa crouched beside him, examining the prints closely. She traced them with her fingers and then looked up at him, her expression serious. She pointed in the direction of the prints, then to herself, then to Elias. He understood immediately. They needed to be cautious. The predator might still be nearby, and both of them had to move quietly and carefully. They continued along the valley floor, using natural cover to stay hidden. Birds took flight at their approach, and small animals scurried away at the sound of their footsteps. Elias could feel his senses sharpening, his eyes and ears straining for any sign of danger. Natsa was constantly aware, her movements quick and efficient. She occasionally paused to teach him subtle ways to observe the environment. The way a broken twig might indicate a recent passage, the smell of the air signaling a predator, the change in the sound of the wind through the trees. Elias realized that these small lessons were priceless, and that he was learning more than survival skills. He was learning to see the forest as she did, as a living, breathing entity full of stories and warnings. By midday, they reached a small stream winding through the valley. Elias took a moment to drink, cupping the cold water in his hands. Natsa gestured toward a flat rock nearby, indicating that they should take a short break. As they rested, Elias observed her quietly. She moved with ease, checking the area, arranging their supplies, and maintaining vigilance even during the brief pause. Her focus never wavered, and Elias felt a deep respect for her ability to balance caution with confidence. As they continued along the stream, they spotted signs of deer and other game. Natsa signaled for Elias to stay low and move carefully. They approached a small clearing where a deer was grazing. Elias froze, studying the animal while Natsa readied her bow. She whispered instructions to him, using gestures and short phrases. Elias followed her directions exactly, learning to move silently and with purpose. When the moment came, Natsa released her arrow with deadly accuracy, and the deer fell without making a sound. Elias moved quickly to secure it, amazed at the seamless cooperation between them. After preparing their meal, they continued along the stream, their minds focused on the journey ahead. The forest was dense, and the path became more challenging. Rocks and fallen trees forced them to climb and maneuver carefully. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, and Elias could feel the temperature dropping. Natsa noticed his tension and gave a reassuring smile. She pointed to a nearby grove of pines and gestured that they should make camp there for the night. Elias nodded, grateful for her guidance. As they set up their temporary shelter, Elias reflected on the bond that had developed between them. What had started as a strange encounter, born from a joke, had grown into a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. Natsa had taught him more than he could have imagined about survival, observation, and patience. He, in turn, offered his strength, knowledge of traps, and determination to face the hardships of the wilderness. Together, they had formed a team that could handle almost any challenge. Night fell and the forest grew quiet except for the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. Elias and Natsa sat by the fire, eating their meal and sharing small observations about the day. Words were minimal, but their communication was effective. Elias realized that the silence between them was not empty, it was filled with understanding and shared experience. He felt a sense of calm, knowing that he was not entirely alone in this wild place. Sleep came uneasily, interrupted by strange sounds in the forest. Elias lay awake for a time, listening to the rustling of leaves and the distant cries of animals. He could sense the tension in the air, the subtle threats that came with living in such an untamed land. Natsa stirred beside him, and he noticed her eyes opening briefly to scan the surroundings before she settled again. Her vigilance was instinctive, and Elias found comfort in knowing she was alert and capable. The next morning, they awoke to fog blanketing the valley. Visibility was limited, and the air was damp and cold. Elias shivered as he packed his belongings, grateful for the fire from the previous night. Natsa moved efficiently, collecting water and arranging their packs. The fog made navigation challenging, but Elias trusted her judgment completely. She paused frequently to read the signs of the forest, listening to the sounds carried by the mist and observing the subtle movements of animals. They moved cautiously through the fog, their senses heightened. Elias noticed how every small detail mattered, the way a branch bent, the direction of footprints, the sound of water trickling over rocks. Natsa guided him through the terrain with quiet authority, teaching him to interpret the forest as she did. He began to understand the importance of patience and observation, and how rushing or ignoring subtle signs could lead to danger. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing a wide valley with rolling hills and scattered trees. Elias spotted a small herd of deer grazing in the distance. He signaled to Natsa, and they approached carefully, moving low and silent. The hunt required precision and teamwork. Natsa readied her bow and whispered instructions to Elias, who followed each direction without hesitation. When the moment arrived, she released her arrow with perfect aim, and the deer fell. Elias helped secure the animal, impressed by the efficiency and skill of their cooperation. As they rested after the hunt, Elias realized how much he had learned in the short time they had been together. He had not only gained practical skills, but also a new understanding of trust and partnership. Natsa's humor and teasing, once confusing, now made sense as a way to communicate and build connection in a world where words were limited. He admired her resilience, intelligence, and ability to remain calm under pressure. Evening came, and the cold returned with the fading sun. Elias and Natsa prepared their shelter and fire for the night, sharing their meal and reviewing the day's journey. Elias felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude for her guidance. The mountains were unforgiving, yet with her by his side, he felt capable of facing any challenge. They communicated in gestures and expressions, their bond strengthened by shared experience and understanding. As they lay under the stars, Elias reflected on how much he had changed since meeting Natsa. The wilderness had always been a place of survival, but now it had become a place of learning, connection, and mutual respect. He thought about her words from their first encounter. "We're alone, let's do what's necessary," and he understood them more deeply now. It was not just about survival. It was about trust, cooperation, and the ability to adapt to a world that demanded skill, patience, and intelligence. Sleep came gradually, accompanied by the distant sounds of the forest. Elias felt a sense of security and calm, knowing that he was not alone. Natsa's presence had transformed his experience in the wilderness, teaching him lessons that went beyond hunting or navigation. She had shown him the value of observation, patience, and the quiet strength found in partnership. The next day brought new challenges. They encountered a narrow canyon, the walls steep and jagged, with a fast-moving stream at the bottom. Navigating it required careful planning. Natsa led the way, testing the rocks and choosing a path that minimized risk. Elias followed, adjusting his steps to match her pace and using the skills she had taught him. Together, they moved carefully, avoiding loose rocks and treacherous footing. At one point, Elias slipped slightly on a wet rock, and Natsa reached out, steadying him with a firm grip. The brief contact was reassuring, and he realized how much he had come to rely on her guidance and support. They continued through the canyon, the stream rushing beside them, until they reached a safer area where they could rest and assess the terrain ahead. The day continued with small victories and lessons. They hunted, gathered water, and maintained their shelter. Elias marveled at how Natsa could read the land, anticipate challenges, and adapt quickly. He followed her lead, learning not just to survive, but to move efficiently, safely, and thoughtfully through the wilderness. By evening, they found a small grove of trees that offered protection from the wind. They built a fire, prepared their meal, and reflected quietly on the day's journey. Elias felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing they had navigated difficult terrain and survived the challenges together. He looked at Natsa, appreciating not only her skill but also the bond that had grown between them. A bond forged through necessity, respect, and shared experience. As the stars appeared in the night sky, Elias realized that he had found more than just a survival partner in Natsa. He had discovered a teacher, a guide, and a companion who had transformed his understanding of the wilderness and his own abilities. The mountains were still harsh, still unforgiving, but with her by his side, he felt a quiet confidence, a sense that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning sun peeked over the mountains, spilling golden light across the valley where Elias and Natsa had camped. The night had been cold, and frost still clung to the branches and the ground. Elias rose slowly, stretching his stiff muscles, grateful for the warmth of the fire that had burned through the night. Natsa was already awake, gathering water from the small stream nearby, moving with her usual quiet efficiency. She glanced back at him, offering a small, knowing smile that seemed to say, "Are you ready for what comes next?" Elias nodded. Today would be a day of choices. The path ahead led them closer to the edges of the territory, where towns and settlements would appear, along with people who did not understand the ways of the wilderness. For weeks, they had survived together, learning from each other, forming a partnership built on trust, patience, and respect. Now, the time had come to decide whether their journey together would end, or whether they would continue into an uncertain future as a team. They began walking along the ridge, moving carefully but steadily. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of morning, birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the distant murmur of a waterfall. Elias noticed how Natsa observed everything, from the tracks of small animals to the direction of the wind, using the information to guide their path. He had learned much from her, but he also realized that their journey had taught him about himself. He had discovered patience, resilience, and the ability to trust another human being, even in a world that demanded constant vigilance. As the day progressed, they encountered more wildlife. Deer grazed at a distance, rabbits scurried through the underbrush, and a lone fox darted across a clearing. Elias and Natsa moved with quiet precision, sometimes pausing to observe, sometimes to hunt. Their cooperation had become seamless, a rhythm of actions and responses that required no words. Elias could anticipate her gestures, and she, in turn, seemed to understand his intentions. It was a level of understanding that only comes from shared experience, from the constant reliance on one another in a challenging environment. Around midday, they came to a small canyon. The walls rose steep and jagged on either side, and a stream rushed through the center. Navigating it would require careful planning. Natsa studied the terrain, her eyes scanning every rock and ledge. She pointed to a narrow path along the edge of the canyon, indicating that Elias should follow. He nodded, trusting her judgment completely. Together, they moved slowly, carefully testing each step and ensuring that the footing was secure. Every movement required focus, and both understood that a single misstep could result in injury. Halfway across the canyon, Elias paused to catch his breath. The view below was breathtaking, the rushing water glinting in the sunlight. He marveled at the beauty of the wilderness, even as he remained aware of its dangers. Natsa crouched beside him, whispering instructions in broken English and gestures, guiding him safely along the edge. Elias felt a quiet gratitude for her presence. She had not only taught him skills for survival, but had also given him confidence in his own abilities. He realized that their bond had grown far beyond necessity. It had become a genuine connection forged in shared hardship and trust. By late afternoon, they reached the other side of the canyon. The terrain flattened slightly, and the forest opened into a wide valley. They took a moment to rest, drinking water and sharing a small meal of dried meat and berries. Elias observed Natsa as she moved about, tending to the fire and checking the surrounding area for signs of danger. He noted how calm and composed she remained, even after weeks of harsh conditions and challenges. Her resilience was remarkable, and he felt a deep respect for her strength and intelligence. As the sun began to lower in the sky, Elias realized that they were nearing the edges of the settlements. Smoke rose in the distance, and faint sounds of human activity carried on the wind. The thought of returning to towns after weeks in the wilderness filled him with mixed emotions. On one hand, the comforts of civilization, warmth, food, and safety were appealing. On the other, he knew that the bond he had formed with Natsa and the lessons he had learned in the wild could not be replicated in the towns. They had shared something unique, a connection forged through necessity, trust, and mutual respect. Natsa noticed his thoughtful expression and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her gesture was simple, but it carried meaning. She was acknowledging the unspoken question between them. What would happen now? Elias understood without words. They had to make a choice, part ways and return to their separate lives, or continue together into an uncertain future. The decision weighed heavily on both of them, but Elias felt a quiet certainty. Whatever choice they made, it had to honor the bond they had formed and the experiences they had shared. As they continued, they came across a small ridge that overlooked the settlements below. Elias could see the clustered rooftops, the smoke rising from chimneys, and people moving about their daily routines. It was a world so different from the mountains they had traversed together. He knew that returning meant leaving the freedom and simplicity of the wilderness, but it also meant safety and stability. He looked at Natsa, and in her eyes he saw the same contemplation. They understood each other without speaking, the weight of the moment shared silently between them. After a long pause, they began their descent toward the settlements. The path was rocky and steep, but they moved carefully, supporting each other when necessary. Elias felt a strange mixture of anticipation and sadness. The journey together was ending, yet the lessons, the bond, and the shared memories would remain with him forever. Natsa moved with her usual precision, guiding him through the difficult terrain, ensuring that they both arrived safely. As they reached the outskirts of the first settlement, villagers stopped and stared at the pair. Elias noticed the curiosity in their eyes, the questions unspoken. They had been alone in the wilderness for weeks, and their appearance reflected that life. Clothing worn and patched, faces weathered by sun and wind, eyes sharp and alert. Natsa moved confidently, her presence commanding respect. Elias felt a sense of pride and gratitude for her guidance, knowing that without her, the journey would have been far more dangerous. They spent the night on the edge of the settlement, keeping a low profile. Elias and Natsa shared a simple meal and prepared for the final part of their journey. The next morning, they would go their separate ways. The thought was bittersweet. They had survived together, learned from each other, and formed a bond that transcended culture and circumstance. Parting would be difficult, but necessary. Elias knew that both of them had responsibilities and connections to their own communities. Before dawn, they packed their belongings and prepared to leave. Elias glanced at Natsa, noting the determination in her eyes. She had faced the wilderness with courage, skill, and intelligence. He had learned more than survival. He had learned about patience, observation, trust, and the quiet strength found in partnership. Their journey had changed him, leaving a lasting impression on his character and outlook on life. As they walked through the final stretch of forest before the settlement, they moved in silence. Words were not necessary. Their understanding and respect spoke louder than any conversation could. Elias felt a deep sense of gratitude for the experiences they had shared and for the bond that had grown between them. Natsa's presence had transformed his journey, making it not just a tale of survival, but a story of connection and learning. When they reached the edge of the village, they stopped. Elias turned to Natsa, feeling the weight of the moment. She smiled softly, a mixture of pride, respect, and understanding. He extended his hand, and she took it briefly, a simple gesture that conveyed the depth of their shared experiences. Words were unnecessary. The connection they had formed was clear, strong, and enduring. They parted ways at the village boundary. Natsa disappeared into the paths of her people, moving with the same quiet confidence that had guided her through the wilderness. Elias turned to face the mountains, now visible in the distance, and felt a sense of both completion and longing. The journey had been challenging, transformative, and unforgettable. He knew that the lessons and memories would remain with him for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, Elias often thought of Natsa. He recounted stories of their journey to those who would listen, describing the skill, intelligence, and courage of the young Apache woman who had taught him so much. Her name became a symbol of resilience, resourcefulness, and the quiet power of partnership. And in Natsa's tribe, the story of the mountain man who had survived the wilderness by working alongside a clever and brave woman was passed down as a tale of respect, trust, and the importance of learning from one another. Though their paths diverged, the impact of their journey together endured. Elias returned to the mountains for other expeditions, always carrying the lessons of patience, observation, and cooperation. Natsa continued to thrive among her people, sharing the knowledge she had gained and the stories of the strange, capable mountain man who had survived by listening, learning, and trusting in her guidance. The wilderness remained a place of challenge and beauty, unforgiving yet full of lessons. Elias and Natsa had learned that survival was not just about strength or skill, but about understanding, respect, and the willingness to rely on one another. Their journey had been brief in the grand scale of time, yet it left a lasting legacy of courage, partnership, and shared wisdom. And so the mountains held their story quietly, the memory of two people who met by chance, survived by necessity, and formed a bond that neither distance nor time could erase. Elias and Natsa had faced the wilderness together, navigated its dangers, and learned from each other. Their journey was a testament to the power of trust, cooperation, and the human spirit when guided by respect, intelligence, and courage. The sun set over the peaks, casting a warm glow over the valleys. Elias looked back one last time before continuing on his path, carrying with him the lessons, memories, and the quiet knowledge that some bonds, though brief, can leave a permanent mark on the heart and mind. Natsa returned to her people, her steps confident, her mind filled with the experience of having survived alongside someone who had become more than a companion, a mirror of resilience, courage, and adaptability. The mountains remained, silent witnesses to their story, holding in their forests, streams, and ridges the echoes of a journey that had transformed two lives forever. He drifted into sleep, the fire's warmth fading into the night, comforted by the presence of someone who had become both a teacher and a companion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Elias knew they would face them together, as a team navigating a world where survival demanded skill, intelligence, and trust.